chat, and Tess will be facilitating that as well. So with that, let's dive right in. So what is ERAP? So the Emergency Rental Assistance Program is a temporary program to pay rental arrears that accumulated during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's versions of these in every state and territory of the US, as well as even versions in several cities and counties of 200,000 or more people. As far as the city of New York, I'm based in the Bronx. So a lot of this is going to be New York City centric, but the program is a statewide program. So it's not just for New York City, it's for just about everywhere in the state, although a few cities opted out initially. And some of them have their own programs. But the city of New York received about $644.5 million. The entire state of New York, including state and local allocations combined, received about $2.3 billion. And that's what's coming from, or that's what came from the federal government. The state pitched in an additional amount of funding that I believe brought that up to $2.4 billion. And this was, a few months ago. And then very recently, in the emergency session called by Governor Hochul, the state of New York allocated an additional amount to ERAP, including $125 million, starting September 15th, so just 2 weeks ago, for renters who are making up to 120% AMI, who had previously been ineligible for ERAP, because the cap used to be 80% AMI, so now it's gone up. Also, there is, which we will not get into this because it hasn't been quite set up yet, there is going to be an additional amount of funding available for landlords who did not have their tenants apply for ERAP. Maybe they've been trying to get them to apply and they wouldn't, but the landlords themselves would like to. And I believe that this is going to be an additional $75 million. It may actually be more than that, but I believe that's going to be through a slightly different portal than the one that we're going through today that has not yet been completely set up. So who's administering ERAP? It's being done through OTDA, the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. In New York City, HRA is overseeing the implementation of the city ERAP plan and has contracted out the outreach, education, and application assistance to a variety of community-based organizations throughout the city. So if you have questions or if your clients have questions about ERAP, there is a statewide helpline for ERAP. It's 1-844-NY1-RENT. That's 1-844-691-7368. And there's a section for tenants, a section for landlords, and a section for community-based organizations. So depending on which extension you put, you'll be linked up with the folks at the hotline, which are actually contractors for OTDA. They're not OTDA employees directly, but they do run the call center. Also, nysrenthelp.otda.ny.gov is the website for all things ERAP, and in the slides there is the link that has about maybe up to 70 FAQs right now. I think it's about 70 FAQs that they have up there now. So most things that you could have questions with. So who's actually eligible for ERAP? So this is something that has changed since the last presentation. But the eligibility criteria for ERAP is that they have to be tenants who have a household income at or below 80% AMI initially. And that's for the big pot of funding still. But 2 weeks ago, this was expanded to 120% AMI. And that's for the additional $125 million in state funds. Now, they're kind of phasing that in. So until October 29th, priority is going to be given to folks who are at 100% AMI or lower. And then once October 29th hits, it becomes first come, first serve for folks that are 120% AMI or below. So they're basically, if you're right at 120 AMI right now, you can apply, but your application will be basically processed after folks that are at 100% AMI. So that's the income criteria. And then the other criteria are that the tenant has to have experienced the COVID-19 related financial hardship or qualified for unemployment. They have to have a rent obligation at their primary residence that's overdue, and they have to have a demonstrated risk of experiencing housing instability and homelessness. Now, all of these are somewhat nebulous terms, so I'll break them down here in a little bit. But just, we went over those AMI levels. They're different for each county in the state of New York. So if you're somewhere upstate, your levels are probably going to be lower than this. This is just what New York City's, all 5 boroughs, all 5 counties, this is their AMI level. So, you know, 80% household of 166,850, incrementally increasing as you go up in number of household members. So that's what the hard cap used to be until 2 weeks ago. And now it's gone up to the highest you can be at now is this 120% AMI, which for New York City, again, it's 100,320 if you're a household of 1, going up incrementally 143, 160 if you're a household of 4. If you're upstate, you know, it's probably lower. Each county is different. So I don't believe New York City is the highest. Westchester may be higher. I'm not 100% sure. But, you know, just check your AMI listings for 2021. And those numbers are put out by HUD each year. So if you just Google HUD AMI in New York, you can, and make sure it's 2021 because they change them every April. You'll find the amount for your county. I also have links for the ones for New York City that are on a slide at the end of the presentation. So the first criteria was the income. The second is financial hardship. So for financial hardship, it must be determined that on or after March 13th, 2020, a member, that doesn't have to be everyone, it just has to be one member of the household received unemployment benefits or experienced either a reduction in income, incurred significant costs, or experienced financial hardship directly or indirectly due to COVID-19. Now that indirectly part is very important because they're interpreting financial hardship very broadly. So incurring significant costs can literally be they had to buy PPE out of pocket. So I mean, pretty much everybody had to get masks. It could be that, you know, in New York, subways were shut down, so they had to take Ubers, or, you know, maybe when everything was shut down, we went to remote learning or remote work from home, they had to buy supplies for that. Any one of those things would qualify as a COVID-19 related financial hardship because all of those would be considered incurring significant costs. So the financial hardship is interpreted a little broadly. The rent obligation portion is just the tenant is obligated to pay rent at their primary residence and has rent that's overdue at their current residence for rent that they accrued on or after March 13th. So that's a lot of words, but if you break it down and make it a little bit more clear, basically somebody can have more than one residence. That's actually fine, but they can only apply for Erap at what is their primary residence, and at that particular residence, they have to have rent that's overdue that was rent that was overdue that accumulated sometime after March 2020. So if, you know, somehow they have rent from before March 2020 that they haven't paid off, that would actually not qualify for Erap. And they have to still be living in that apartment. So if somebody's in the middle of moving, if they abandon that primary residence, they can't get Erap for that apartment anymore. Also, this is a rent obligation, so you cannot get it for your mortgage if you actually own the property. It's only for folks who are renting. So then risk of housing instability. So they don't actually have to have an eviction case filed against them. They just have to owe rent. And that in itself is deemed to be a risk of housing instability, a risk of homelessness or housing instability. So if somebody is behind on rent, but doesn't have an eviction case, and maybe their landlord's working with them, they might think, oh, I'm not at risk of being homeless, but under the definition of Erap, they qualify. One other important thing, there is no immigration status requirement. So it can be an undocumented household, it can be a household of citizens, permanent residents, a mix of any of the above. Could even be somebody who's on a visitor's visa that's here short term but renting, all of those folks will qualify. So at the very beginning of the program, which I won't touch on this for very long, but there was actually a priority, kind of like what they're doing with the 120% AMI folks now. But there was a priority where if you were at or below 50% AMI and had one of a few risk factors, your application was theoretically reviewed first. There are some folks who applied back in June who still have not been approved or denied yet. So if you have somebody that comes in that says, I submitted my application all the way back in June, they've gotten better to where they are more up to date on some of the applications that they've reviewed, but it could be that they were at the bottom of the priority pile in June and their application still hasn't quite been gotten to yet. Or it could be that maybe they haven't submitted all their documents, maybe their landlord hasn't submitted their documents, but it's just good to know that there was a priority level in June. So if you were at or below 50% AMI, you got bumped up to being reviewed faster. Or if you had one of these 7 priority factors, which are you're unemployed for 90 days, or a veteran, or experiencing domestic violence or human trafficking, or a survivor of human trafficking, or you have an open eviction case, lived in a mobile home, lived in a zip code designated as disproportionately impacted by COVID, or lived in a dwelling of 20 or fewer units. So that's the June priorities. So we've been going over ERAP. What does ERAP actually get you? So if you are applying for ERAP as either a tenant or a landlord, or you're helping or helping somebody apply, ERAP provides up to 12 months of rental arrears payments for rent accrued on or after March 13, 2020, provides up to 3 months of future rent payments, with a caveat that the household has to be expected to spend 30% or more of their gross monthly income to pay for rent, and there are still funds available from the program, and that and it can pay up to 12 months of electric or gas utility arrears payments. Again, those arrears have to be accrued on or after March 13th of 2020. So you can get 12 months of back rent, 3 months of future rent, and 12 months of back gas or electric utilities. I believe you can also get water if you are paying for water, although that's something that the application, which is in 100% online application, by the way. The application isn't really set up for water, but it doesn't cover things like internet or phone or TV or something like that. Just gas, electric, and I believe water as well, and heat. If for some reason the landlord isn't paying heat. But this is all on the tenant end. But the folks that actually get paid are the landlord and property owner and utility company. That payment is made by the state on behalf of the tenant. Tenant applicants will be notified of the amounts that are paid on their behalf. They'll get an email or a physical letter, or sometimes a text. If the tenant submits their application, but the landlord does not submit what the landlord needs to provide on their end, if the application is approved, at least on the tenant's end, funds will be allocated to pay that. Also, I would ask that everyone mute themselves, but Funds will be held for up to 180 days while the landlord is, in theory, being located or getting together whatever documents they need to get together to submit. And then if 180 days go by and there are no landlord documents that get submitted, that money goes back to the program, and it will be deemed that if there is a housing court action, the tenant can actually raise the defense that Erap tried to pay out the landlord for however many months they were approved for, and it can actually be a defense in an eviction case, and it will be deemed that the landlord waived rent for that period of time. So there's a lot of documents that both tenants and landlords have to provide. It's basically to make sure that everything is accurate and the right people are getting paid and the right amounts are getting paid. So this is also a change from the last presentation. Currently, the personal identification is only needed from the primary applicant. So it used to be from every household member. They got rid of that requirement. That can be a driver's license, passport, birth certificate. Every household member that has a social security number needs to provide their social security number. It doesn't have to be their card. It can literally be their name and social written on a piece of paper and a picture of that piece of paper, and it gets uploaded to the portal. There has to be a proof of rental amount. That can be a signed lease, even if it's expired, or rent receipts, canceled check, money order, or a landlord attestation, which is just a letter where the landlord says, this person lives at this address, I'm the landlord, they're the tenant, this is how much they owe, this is how much their rental amount is for each month. There needs to be a proof of residency and occupancy submitted. Again, this could be a signed lease, but it can also be literally a piece of mail that the tenant received in the last 30 days that has their name, their address, and the date in the last 30 days written on. The easiest one's a bill, but in theory, it could be stamped. Proof of income for every household member. So this is not just the primary applicant. This is everybody over the age of 18 or everybody that is employed. So if somebody is below the age of 18 but has a job, they would put that on there. And that can either be through taxes like a Form 1040 or pay stubs for the past month, or even self attestation is allowed, which is every household member that had income gets a piece of paper, writes down their name, writes down how much money they made last year in income, how much money they made last month in income, and the amount for their households. At least that's how I have my clients do it. So far that's been accepted. There actually isn't a ton of guidance on what goes into a self-attestation, but you do need to hit the high points as far as the amount of income, the name, the date. I would have them sign it just so that it's all of the information that's needed is on there. And then again, 12 months of utility arrears. Utilities are things that fluctuate, so they're not like rent. So you will actually need a copy of the gas or electric utility bills to submit with that. It's best to have it for each month going back to however long you're trying to get those utility arrears for. If it goes back to March 2020, that's fantastic. If it goes back the last 12 months, that works. In practice, very few people actually have all of those. So you use what you're able to find and have them contact the utility company. Usually they can get an email with a PDF showing the month by month that they owe. So then there's documents that are needed from landlord applicant, completed W-9, an executed lease, documentation of the rent due from the tenant. That can be a rent ledger, or that can be a rent breakdown or an attestation. The payments are done via direct deposit. So the landlord's banking information is needed. So again, direct deposit, it's not paper checks, it's not money that's sent to the tenant, it is directly deposited into the landlord's bank account. There also needs to be an owner affidavit or signed agreement designating the property management company or agent as the authorized recipient of the Erap funds. So, it needs to be whoever's information is actually on the landlord applicant's document needs to be clear as to who is actually supposed to be receiving these funds. And then the property owner or an authorized property management company will be required to sign the application form and associated certifications agreeing that the information provided, including the amount of rental arrears owed, is accurate and does not duplicate a payment received from another program. So the last thing that you want to happen if you're a landlord is you have to pay back Erap because that month's arrears got paid for by, FEPs or city FEPs or one-shot deal or something like that. You want to make sure there's no duplication. So that's what's needed from a landlord, which I have it as a landlord applicant, but it's really a landlord in any Erap application. So landlords can start the application on their end, and then tenants can do their portion after the landlord does it, or tenants can do their application, let the landlord know the application number, and then the landlord, through their account that they create, puts in all the information on their end and connects it to that specific application. I'll get a little bit more in depth into that in a bit. There are strings to accepting the Erap funds if you're a landlord. You have to agree that by taking the funds, that the Erap payment satisfies the tenant's full rental obligations for the specific time period covered by the payment. So that doesn't mean it zeroes it out. It means if you got paid for 12 months, those specific 12 months, the tenant no longer owes rent. Or if it was 3 months, or so on and so forth. And even if it's future rent, so it could be 15 months. Any late fees for the months that were actually paid out have to be waived, and rent is frozen for a full year for those tenants. And so that's so whatever the rental amount was at the time of the application for Erap becomes whatever the rental amount has to stay at for 1 full year from receipt of the Erap funds. And then also holdover eviction cases are no longer able to be brought against those tenants for a full year. Non-payment eviction cases can be brought. Nuisance eviction cases can be brought. So a holdover is a specific subset of evictions where a tenant is staying in the apartment either without a lease or with an expired lease or without permission of the owner. Those cannot be brought for a full year. But if Erap pays off all of the arrears and then the tenant continues to not pay, a non-payment case could be brought for the new arrears that weren't covered by Erap. There is an exception to holdover cases if the owner is trying to actually move into that unit themselves, or their immediate family members are trying to move into that unit and have it become their primary residence. Then a landlord could bring a holdover case. Housing court impact. So the holdover is obviously big, but also while an Erap application is pending, an active housing court non-payment or holdover case for that apartment gets put on pause and a new one cannot be started. So as I think most of us know, there's currently an eviction moratorium that's active until January 15th of next year, recently reenacted within the past few weeks. But an Erap application is its own moratorium as well. Like I touched on earlier, if a landlord doesn't accept the funds from the Erap program, that can be used as defense in housing court, and it'll be as if rent for that period was waived. Now, on the Erap application itself, there's a spot to put if there is an active housing court case. And if that happens, that should be flagged as a case. Now there are agreements in place between the Office of Court Administration and OTDA for New York City housing courts to be made aware of cases that have submitted Erap applications. I'm not 100% sure what that's going to look like. I don't know if that's actually going to be disclosed to the public or not, but it's in the works. I've been on calls with the legal folks from OCA and calls with folks from OTDA, and it's happening. But it's also a good idea for a tenant to let, or a tenant's attorney, if they already have an attorney, to let housing court know if there has been an Erap application submitted. So all of that is the housing court impact. So Erap at this point has been around for a few months. It went live June 1st, 2021. There is an OTDA website that has a lot of this information. It has some FAQs, some less in-depth overviews. And there has been a ton of interest in Erap. So statewide, as of the 22nd, which is the most recent data, over 215,000 applications statewide have been submitted, and $1.6 billion of funds have been either paid out to the landlords already or have been obligated. So set aside for the landlords, maybe they're waiting on the landlord to submit documentation. There's been a lot more obligated than has actually been paid out. So if you are a landlord, maybe work in supportive housing, maybe, you know, for you're a landlord for whatever reason, you should make sure that if there has been an Erap application submitted, that you get in your documents. In New York City itself, 32,245 applications for rental arrears payments have been paid. Applications are available online in Arabic, Bengali, Chinese, English, Haitian Creole, Korean, Russian, Spanish, and Yiddish. So all of those can happen. So this is what the actual Erap application homepage looks like. It is nysrenthelp.otda.ny.gov. And like I said, the application has to be done online, or there's actually, if somebody does not have the ability to, if somebody doesn't have the ability to,
Yeah.
yeah, so if everybody can unmute themselves, and it looks like there are some folks who are actually writing on the on the Zoom screen. So if you could not do that, I actually haven't seen that before, but that's a new one. But yeah, so you can apply online, or there's actually a phone number to call in and do an application over the phone as well. So this is the application homepage. If somebody is a tenant, they can register through their account, first name, last name, email, password. They do actually need an email to have a tenant account. So sometimes you may have to set up an email for folks that don't have an email yet. But that is the tenant account. And then on the tenant side, they can start a new application. Once they have that tenant account in, there's actually start and resume functionality that was broken for quite a while. So in the last presentation, that was not available. And it's back up and running now, as long as somebody has a tenant account. Application info. There are several tabs to this application, but the actual application info is the first tab. If you're helping a tenant with this, you put in your information, first name, last name, address, phone, email up at the top. And then below is the applicant information, first name, last name, date of birth, address. They actually will, they will probably need a cell phone if they have a tenant account, because there's two-factor authentication that's required. And then they'll put their demographic information, and they'll put their tax information. And again, I see there's a lot of questions in the chat and some folks with their hands raised. I'm going to actually be getting to all of those questions at the end. So the second tab is called the COVID impact tab. So this simply asks if anyone in the household was impacted financially by COVID since March 13th of 2020. And the answer to qualify for Erap has to be yes. But I mean, answer truthfully. Yeah, if any household member was financially impacted by COVID-19, you can say yes due to either an increase in costs or a decrease in income. So the increase in cost is the one that applies to just about everybody. It is everything from having to buy PPE to having to get stuff to work from home, to funeral expenses are one, having to provide for somebody who is sick with COVID, and then the decrease in income is everything from being furloughed to having hours cut, wages cut, stuff like that, having a business temporarily shut down, all of that. And then on this tab, there's also where the tenant puts if they have an eviction case, or if they've been given a notice that their landlord is looking to evict them. The third tab is the household members tab. So this is where you put the information of everyone in the household. So adults and children, if they live there, their information goes to. And it asks for everything from name to age to social security number, relationship to the primary applicant, phone, email, employment status, and if they filed taxes separately or jointly from the primary applicant. So all of those need to be on there for the household members tab. A lot of the times the applicant won't actually know all of this information. Maybe if it's a roommate situation or something like that, or there's a ton of people and they just, may not know all of the information. So it's always good to, before you meet, if you have the ability to, before you meet with the actual tenant applicant, to make sure that they have all that information ready to go, because otherwise it's going to be a lot of back and forth. And, you may be having additional meetings that you wouldn't need to have if they had everything collected and ready to go on your first meeting. So this next tab is the household income tab. So the first question just asks if anybody in the household has income. If you answer no, then it's a pretty quick tab. But if you answer yes, then you have to put every source of income for every household member. So that can be what you traditionally think of, which is employment. So if a household member has employment, and again, I would ask everybody to mute. If a household member has employment, you put how much they make and that it's employment. If somebody's receiving child support, that counts as income. If somebody's receiving a settlement payment, that counts as income. Basically, anything that they are getting money in counts as income. So that's that tab. It's a thing that if you're living with roommates or family members, you may not have any reason to know what they make, or it may be an awkward conversation to have, but it's information that needs to be provided. So the next tab is the lease tab. And this is where you put what the lease terms are. Maybe it's annual, maybe it's month to month. You put when the lease started or when any household member started paying rent, the monthly rental amount, the type of residence, whether it's an apartment or a mobile home or a duplex or whatever it happens to be, the number of bedrooms, if it's on any sort of if it's any special type of housing like rent regulated, rent stabilized, Section 8, public housing, rent controlled, or if it's some other subsidy or no subsidy at all. And then the type of housing or the type of leasing arrangement, which could be anything from renting the entire unit to renting a room, to renting a lot, to actually being on a sublease. We get a lot of folks that are subletting, and they qualify for Erap as long as the landlord has not been paid. If they owe money to the primary tenant, but the primary tenant has paid to the landlord, so the landlord is not actually owed anything, then unfortunately that person would not qualify for Erap. But everybody's situation is different, so maybe you don't actually know if the landlord has been paid or not. It doesn't hurt to apply for Erap. So this is the rental arrears tab. This is tab number 6. You have to put in the amount of rent for each month, the amount of rent that is still due for that particular month, and any fees for that month. And then at the bottom, you can select whether or not you'd like to ask for the 3 months of additional rent. The utility tab, very similar, except it breaks up gas, electric, and heat as their own thing. Asks for the account number and whose name it's under and who the utility provider is. There's a drop-down list that has, I don't know, about 40-ish utility providers. In New York City and a lot of other places throughout the state, gas and electrics through the same folks, but you do actually have to list those separately. And again, up to 12 months of utility arrears can be paid. There is a requirement that there has to be some amount of rental arrears still owed. So this is the application other assistance tab. So if somebody has applied for some other source of rental assistance, this is where that gets listed. Or if maybe some outside charity has committed to help with rent, that gets listed here as well. Maybe somebody's on a subsidy, that gets listed as well. There's a ton of people who are on rental subsidies and the subsidies are still paying, but they had a portion, they have other rental arrears. That doesn't mean that they don't qualify for Erap, but they do just have to put, I am getting a subsidy for assisting me with rent, and because they want to make sure that there's no double payments. Then there's the communication preferences tab. This is just, would the tenant like to be communicated email, text, or paper mail? Again, it's available in all of the languages that the application's available in. And it also is available even in Braille or a CD or large print. Those are all available. Finally, this is what's called the applicant certification tab. It's about 10 paragraphs that the applicant has to certify that everything that they're saying is accurate upon penalty of perjury, and that the various interested local, state, and federal agencies can actually do some checks, some background checks, just to make sure that there's no double payments being made. And then finally, all of those documents that we went over earlier have to actually be uploaded. They get uploaded one at a time. The tenant upload and the landlord upload look very similar, but you have to, it has to be a certain file type, so like PDF, JPG, JPEG. Then they upload that one by one. Unfortunately, you can't batch upload them. And then that's in. You have to make sure that the application is associated with the tenant account before you do those uploads. And then on the landlord side, the landlord can actually go in under the landlord owner account, search for the application using the application number and the date of birth of that tenant, and then that application will pop up. They can associate that with their landlord or owner account, and then can upload their documentation as well. So there is an application number that's generated when the application's being worked on. Usually it's within the first 2 or 3 tabs. A green thing will pop up like it looks like on the screen here, and it'll be, I believe, 5-digit information. It's a combination of letters and numbers, and that is the unique application number. And you need to make sure that whoever is applying for that keeps that, because that is the only way they can find that application again, is through the application number and the date of birth of the primary applicant. So you can check the application status using the application number and date of birth. And then also, again, I would ask everyone to mute themselves if they're not already muted. And then also, if you have any questions about Erap, you can call the statewide hotline, 1-844-NY1-RENT. That's 1-844-691-7368. And there's even an option for folks who are hearing impaired. There's a TTY teletype phone number that is 1-833-843-8829. The hotline is staffed from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday. So it's closed on Sunday, but every other day it's 8 to 7. And that is the statewide hotline. So anywhere in the state that you're doing ERAP, you can call that hotline. Again, landlords are actually required to create their own account. They can do that at this link. It's a lot like the tenant account name. What has it set up as first name and last name. Obviously, if you're an entity, you can figure out how you want to input that. You put in your email, you put in your password, you register, you select that you're not a robot, and that is how you do that. And then again, uploading the documents for owners, it's pretty much the exact same thing as it was for tenants. So I won't go over that too much more in depth. Again, it has to be a PDF, JPG, JPEG, or PNG file type. It has to be uploaded one document at a time, and the maximum allowed file size is 4 megabytes. Now, there is an option where you can upload documents to your landlord or owner account, and that's great. But you also need to make sure that you're uploading those documents to the specific applications as well. So there's a lot of times where landlords have documents that are uploaded to their own account, but they didn't actually either associate the application with their account, or they didn't upload those documents to the application as well. And sometimes that throws the folks reviewing it off, and they don't see those documents, so the landlords have to upload them again. There's also what's called the ERAP application landlord rent form. So this is where, if you're a landlord, you put in the amount of rent, the amount past due, and the prospective rent amount. This is very important if somebody is asking for future rent. Sign date with the landlord or property manager's name, and this is the landlord rent form. So after an application is submitted, so this is completely new from the last presentation. So once an application is submitted and all documents are uploaded by the tenant and the owner/landlord, an application should be approved or denied in about 6 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer. Now, it's important that the tenant and the landlord know that they will be receiving communications from OTDA or the individual reviewing their application contracted by OTDA. The CBO provider or person who helped them submit the application will not hear anything. So the only communications go directly to the tenant or the landlord at the information they provided. The CBO providers don't get any communication, unfortunately. They'll receive an email, text, or a letter, whichever method they selected on the application, letting them know that their documents need to be uploaded. Failure to provide the necessary documents will result in a second notification. Following that, if they're still not provided, the application will be placed into pending withdrawal status. And after a period of time that happens, it will be eventually denied. If the tenant submits all of the information on their end, but the landlord does not, the application will be provisionally approved, and the tenant and landlord should receive a provisional approval notification. And then once that happens, the 180-day clock for landlords to submit their documents so that they can get paid starts to run. There's also an appeal process for Erap decisions. It's a fairly simple appeal process. To appeal an Erap decision, whether it's on the tenant side or the landlord side, if you want to appeal a denial or you disagree with the amount that you were approved for, you have 30 days after receiving the determination to request an appeal. That request gets done by calling that state hotline, which is 844-NY1-RENT. Also, there's the number for folks who are hearing impaired, 1-833-843-8829. The appellate will receive a notification confirming that they have received the appeal request. From then, there's 10 days from receiving that notification to submit any documents or information that explains why the appellate thinks OTDA's decision was wrong or why the amount was wrong. And then that's how you do an appeal. I do have some eligibility sample Q&As, but in the interest of time, I'm not actually going to go through those. They will be in the slides. But there are some resources. You can go to any of these links. The slides will be provided if you would like them. But you can go to these links to get more information on Erap. This AMI link, I believe, is actually for the whole state. So if you look on it, you'll have your county right there. And then OTDA actually has some YouTube videos that go actually a little bit less in depth, but provide a good overview as to some various things about emergency rental assistance. Now, application assistance. So I actually work for BronxWorks, which is a community-based organization that provides application assistance to folks here in the Bronx with submitting Erap applications and uploading documents. We are in a coalition, so it's about 6 or 7 nonprofits. Our website is bxran.org. That's the coalition website for our Erap coalition down in the Bronx. Or you can call 844-381-9169. You can have the tenant or landlord call that number. And that is our hotline, or hotline that we have ourselves. It's different than the state hotline, but folks can get their information put in so that they can get set up with an appointment for application assistance. Again, that's in the Bronx. Also in the Bronx is an organization called NICA. Their phone number is on there. And then This link at the bottom is for application assistance providers in New York City in general. There's some in each borough. I believe there's 2 or 3 in Manhattan. There's, I think, 3 or 4 in Brooklyn and Queens, and there's 1 in Staten Island, and then there's those 2 in the Bronx. And outside of New York City, different counties, different cities do things differently. So in some places, it's the local social service district that does the actual application assistance. Some places it's contracted out to nonprofits. There may be some places that actually don't have application assistance providers. I'm not sure if there are some for each county, but I believe the vast majority of counties, if not all, have designated application assistance providers. And so with that, that is our presentation, and we'll open it up to Q&As.
Thank you so much, Jordan. I know we asked you to pack a lot of information into a slightly shorter presentation than I normally would fit into, so we really appreciate that. So we have a lot of questions. If some things have been are clearly detailed in the PowerPoint, just let me know and I will flag that. And maybe you don't have to give a long answer. And depending on time, if some things feel like they're a bit too long or it'll take a bit to answer, I might flag that and I'll get that answer from you over email. So I'm going to go by sections, and in the meantime, please feel free to enter more questions into the chat. But right now we're going to start with the application process. So someone asked, how can we check on our client's Erap application to verify that all the client and landlord documents have been uploaded to Erap? They want to know if calling was the only option.
So calling is potentially the easiest option, depending on how long the wait time is when you call that state hotline. Now, if you call the hotline, they're going to make sure that you have the tenant on the phone with you. That tenant's going to have to provide their date of birth and sometimes some other identifying information. Just because of privacy concerns, I mean, in theory, anybody, anywhere could just call up the hotline and say, you know, what's all this highly sensitive information on this particular person. So they try to make sure that, that you have the client's consent if you're doing that. But other than that, if the tenant has an Erap account, they can sign into that account and go to what's called check application status. And that will show everything that's been, that will show the most recent status, and it will also show all the documents that the tenant submitted. If you're a landlord, you can log in through your landlord side, and it'll show the landlord documents that have been submitted. It won't show the tenant documents. And then if there is no tenant account, you can just go to check application status off of the Erap website, and it will give you a lot less information, but it will at least show you if the application's been approved or not. You need the application number and the tenant's date of birth to do that.
Great, thank you. Is there a link available for providers to apply for Erap on behalf of their clients? So
the link to apply for Erap, just period. Let me actually put that in the link. It is nysrenthelp.otda.ny.gov. And that is whether you're a tenant, a landlord, community-based organization, somebody that's helping anybody apply for Erap, that's what you go to. This is the English version, but there's versions in 9 languages, I believe. Now, one thing that I didn't mention in the presentation is once you start an application, you are stuck with that language. So make sure you start it in whatever language you want everything to be.
Okay, that was a helpful tip, thank you. And how long after submitting an application does the tenant hear back from an Erap representative?
So in theory, 4 to 6 weeks. In actuality, I think for the first for the first applications in June, I think it was 2 months. Also, it depends application by application, because the 4 to 6 weeks for a determination, which I believe is almost never 4, it's usually 6 or more, is a date that's if the application has been fully submitted and every single document from the tenant and the landlord that was needed was submitted. So if there's folks that haven't submitted everything they needed, it could be a lot longer.
Okay. Sorry, so I think this question kind of relates to a previous one. Are there any other options to send documents besides uploading them to the application? Can you mail them in, maybe?
You cannot, unfortunately. So there is no mailing in of documents. It's literally only through doing it online. You can, in theory, apply over the phone, calling the Erap hotline, but what actually happens in a lot of instances is those people get referred to community-based organizations to have them physically go into their offices and do it online anyway. But what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to be able to do it online with the person on the hotline. But as far as uploading documents, the only way to do that is online.
Understood. Okay. So this question, at a landlord's request, can an application be removed after submission?
So no, if there needs to be some updating, if there's information that was wrong, maybe all of the arrears got paid off by the tenant, so nothing is owed, you can call in to that hotline and put in a request for that to be updated. If there's new documents like a new rent breakdown or some new information, you can upload those documents after the application's been submitted. Might not be a bad idea to call the hotline to let them know that that's been done, but you cannot just you cannot call to have an application deleted. Now, if you're doing a whole new one, you and the tenant can call in and say, hey, now there's more than one application. The old one had a lot of problems, so get rid of that. And then, maybe they can remove an old application. Yeah, that's how you would go about all of that.
Great. How do you report additional hardships caused by COVID after the original application was submitted?
So you can call the hotline and let them know that, to flag that. Honestly, it's not really necessary. If there are any hardships listed whatsoever on the original application, you qualify. So if more happen, that's not really something that's going to affect your application.
Great, it's good to know. Can an individual with rent arrears of $14,000 apply for Erap?
So any individual with rental arrears of any amount can apply for Erap. Erap will only pay 12 months of arrears and 12 months of utilities, though, and possibly 3 months of future rent. There is actually an issue now where there's been a lot of money already allocated. So there's been over 200,000 applications. So the money for future rent may not be there in the next few weeks. And even the program, they're trying to get additional funding for that right now. So that is something to keep in mind. So it's better to apply sooner rather than later, especially right now.
What do you do if a client does not have an email address?
So that is not the best situation. I've had to create a ton of email addresses for folks who maybe might not be the most computer savvy. I had to teach them how to use email. I had to teach them where to find the app on their phone. That's kind of what you have to do, because you can submit an application without an email. You just can't then go back and check the status really well. You can't really do anything like that, unfortunately.
Those are challenging circumstances, but it seems like it's best just to include an email if possible. Okay. Oh, for clients that are receiving SSI and SSD benefits and have not been able to obtain reward letters from for 2020 to 2021, what else can be submitted?
So for income, you can actually submit what's called a self attestation, which is literally you get a piece of paper, say this is my name, this is where I live, this is how much money I made last year in income, this is how much money I made last month in income. And if it's SSI, I actually believe they don't, I'll have to go back and check, but I don't believe they count that as income. So you might even want to put on there, that is from SSI and I have no other sources of income, or whatever other sources of income there are, you can put that as well.
Okay. So for a nonprofit organization, who should apply for arrears, the tenant or the landlord, or both together?
Both together. So both the tenant and the landlord have to submit their side of the application for these funds to get paid out. Now, typically, who may be walking into your office might be the tenant. And so once you do that side of things, then you call the landlord or have the tenant call the landlord or email the landlord is even better and say, here's the application number, here's the tenant's date of birth, fill out your end so you can get paid. But I mean, if it's the landlord that's coming in, you can also do a lot of things as the landlord. You can submit your documents first. You can reach out to the tenant to pay. There are landlords who have been trying to get tenants to do these applications for a while, and it just hasn't happened. It used to be that the landlords would not get paid by Erap, and it was just an unfortunate situation. Now there's been money that's been earmarked specifically for landlords who are in that situation. There will be a different portal that's created than the one that I went through. It hasn't been created yet, but that is coming in the future.
So now we're moving on to our next category. And this question is, does someone qualify if schools and daycares close and you had to pay for private childcare fees? And in the same vein, what if you need your car to keep your job and you had to pay to get your car fixed, causing you to fall behind in rent? So I guess these questions are trying to get at like what counts as hardship.
Sure. So I think the remote learning was specifically listed as one of the increase in costs. Now the car issue, that would not necessarily count unless you could use it as alternative. I think if you had to take alternative transportation than usual, that could count. So if you were taking a subway or a bus typically, and then you had to take your car because you were afraid of being in a enclosed space with folks because you might get COVID, then your car becomes your alternative transportation. But the easiest one is just buying PPE, or also having to buy essential items that were more expensive. So if everybody can think back to the beginning of the pandemic, which reportedly is happening again, but toilet paper, food, all of that, the prices skyrocketed. It was hard to find them. That counts.
Great, that's super helpful. Going to supportive housing, we had a number of questions about related to it. Are subleases accepted from supportive housing when the program does not own the building?
So the person, so this is potentially a case-by-case basis. So the landlord is the organization or person that has to be owed rent. So if the landlord has not been paid, then that qualifies for Erav. Now, supportive housing situation is sometimes more complicated than the typical sublease. So my advice would be, it's better to apply for Erap and get rejected than to take yourself out of the running and just not apply for it Also, I should mention that I do application assistance. I submit applications. I do not do any review of applications. I don't work for OTDA. I work for a nonprofit that does a lot of these application submissions.
Is a supportive housing tenant eligible to apply? And what about a subleaser? Oh, we got that. We got that. What about a subleaser in supportive housing? And is a supportive housing tenant eligible to apply?
Yeah, so if you're on a sublease, you can apply. And again, how they determine for subleases is whether or not the landlord is owed money. They don't really care, unfortunately, about whether or not the prime tenant is owed money. It's all about the landlord.
Okay, just reading through. Okay, so moving on to, oh, I see we have a couple more questions. About the application process, can a client use a social worker's, their social worker's email address for the application if they do not have their own?
So that's a tough one. I'm not sure if, I think that's something where you may want to see if there is a policy for your organization that you can come up with on that. Because I can think of a lot of privacy concerns. I can think of just a lot of issues that would come up with that. My life would be a lot easier if I used my email for a lot of these Erap applications, but there's just a lot of unforeseen and probably foreseeable issues that come up if you do that.
Okay. Okay. So once a landlord decides, so now we're moving on to some landlord related questions. Once a landlord decides to participate in Erap along with the tenant, how does it work with a new lease? Is the landlord then obligated to re-sign a lease with the tenant? Can it be month to month? Are there any requirements around that?
Sure. So so just a market rate apartment, there's not any obligation to provide the tenant with a new lease. There is the fact that you are going to not be able to bring a holdover case for a full year if that money gets approved from the date that the money is distributed. So you don't have to provide a lease, but they're going to be there for a year, probably a little bit longer. So let's say 13, 14 months, they are entitled to be there without you trying to get them out for a holdover. Now, if they aren't paying, then yeah, that's a different story. But so it's probably in the landlord's best interest to provide with a new lease because 12 months is a long time. But there's no requirement unless it's a rent stabilized apartment, in which case all of the rent stabilization requirements apply, or if it's under some other program that requires you to give tenants a lease, then all of those things apply. Erap doesn't affect that.
And when should a landlord expect to be given information about the documents that are needed for their part of the application?
So in theory, the tenant should reach out to the landlord themselves and let them know the application number and the date of birth. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And the tenant is actually not obligated to let them know. But if that happens, OTDA should be reaching out to the landlord or one of the contractors for OTDA. I believe the folks that are on the hotline or work with Deloitte, actually. So they're private contractors. And the folks that run the website is actually another private contractor called Guidehouse. But the folks that are actually reviewing the applications and doing all of that will actually reach out in theory, to let the landlords know what has to be submitted. But if you know there's been an application submitted, you can always call that hotline and see if the landlord documents have been submitted or not. There's also a list of documents that are needed. You can get that from calling the hotline or from going to that Erap website.
Great. So related to that, what happens if a landlord knows that they need to, submit certain required documents while having the application number, but they do not submit the documents?
So that is when if the application would have been approved, but for the landlord, it gets put into, I believe it's called provisional approval status, and the money gets allocated based on what the tenant submitted. The money does not get paid because there is no payment information for the direct deposit. And the 180-day clock starts to run. If at the end of those 180 days, the landlord hasn't submitted their information, then that money goes back to the program, and the tenant can take the letter that they got from OTDA saying, you got approved for this amount for these months, with them to housing court, show the judge, and whenever an eviction case happens, and it will be deemed that the landlord decided they didn't want to get paid for those months.
Okay. And I'm wondering, I'm not sure if it's the same answer for this question. What if a landlord refuses to provide rent or lease information or tax ID, things like that?
Yeah, so that's all the same answer as the last question, but there's various nuances as to what all the things that can go wrong, but that's how they deal with it.
If a tenant was approved for ERAP and the landlord has accepted payment, but the tenant continues to be non-payment, can the landlord take the tenant to court during the 1-year obligation?
Yes, so they cannot take they can take the tenant to court in a non-payment eviction action, but not in a holdover eviction action. So those are two different causes of action. One's being late on rent, one is being there without the landlord's permission. So you've given them permission to be there, but you haven't given them permission to not pay. So you can start an eviction case for non-payment, although it's stayed while the Erap application is pending, and there's also an eviction moratorium until January 15th. But that is how that works.
Great. Really quick, everyone, you may have just seen an evaluation poll pop up. Please take time to answer those questions. It's super fast. Thank you. Okay. We are almost done, Jordan. I promise. I know. Thank you.
I have more time.
You're amazing. Thank you. If a person owns a co-op or a condo, are they considered the landlord?
So that depends on the co-op or the condo. If you are in a situation where you have a condo and you owe condo fees, those are unfortunately not covered by Erap. If you are in a condo and you're actually a renter within the condo, so you don't actually own it, then you would qualify for Erap. And then, who is actually the landlord? In theory, so that's a little bit tougher. So it might be the condo board, it might be the co-op board. That's
My case.
something that you actually look at the actual agreements.
Okay. How can a nonprofit get paid by the tenant when arrears are owed directly to the program and not to the landlord?
So again, this would be sort of a sublease situation. So the landlord gets paid directly, the nonprofit would not get paid. But that if you do it the right way and you can get it so that the landlord gets paid from this program, then whatever you would have had to pay the landlord should get credited back to you. But that's something that you would have to work out.
Okay. And is the payout to the landlord paid as a lump sum, or is it done over time?
So it is a lump sum direct deposit. So it's not a bunch of different smaller ones. It's one chunk, and it's not a check. It's literally directly into the bank account.
All right. So now, would you mind giving a super brief explanation of the difference between Erap and a one-shot deal?
Sure. So Erap is its own program. It's pretty new. It started in June. One-shot deals have been around for a while. One-shot deals are actually loans that have to be paid back by the tenant. And if they're not paid back, the city will actually sue whoever received that loan for non-payment eventually. I think they've put a hold on that during the pandemic, but it was happening a few years ago. It'll probably be happening here in the next, I don't know when it'll be happening, but eventually it'll start back up again. Erap is a grant. It does not have to be paid back at all. It's using federal money and some state money. And it is essentially free money for tenants. It's a one-time program. So it's probably not going to be around after COVID. One-shot deals will, in theory at least, be around for a while. Also, there's a requirement right now that if you are trying to get rental assistance, you will get rejected for a one-shot deal if you apply for a one-shot deal right now without having applied for Erap first. So the idea is apply for Erap, get your Erap paid or denied, and then apply for a one-shot deal.
Okay, so first line of defense is Erap. If you get denied, go for a one-shot deal.
Yes, and if you get approved and still have arrears, then go for a one-shot deal also.
Great. Okay. So is there a way to apply for assistance, and this might be a one-shot deal, for rent owed before March 13th, 2020?
Yeah, so the one-shot deal is a good idea. If somebody applies for city FEPs or FEPs, they can do that. There's, they can try to get assistance through a charity. Some charities have stuff set aside. But definitely apply for Erap first, because even if you're looking at applying for a one-shot deal, maybe you've paid everything since March 2020 and all that's owed is, before that, I think there's still a requirement that you apply for Erap first.
Great. And the consortium has some resources on city FEPs, and we can share those with this group as well when we send a follow-up email. And
I think also, just to jump in, the levels for city FEPs have gone up quite significantly, so it's a lot stronger tool than it was previously. Absolutely.
Okay, so many Erap applications I've submitted are listed as tenant and landlord documents, verified application status. Okay, so document review completed and yet remain under review. Any idea why that might be the case? Okay, so sorry, I'm reading this live. So a lot of the applications I've submitted listed as tenant and landlord, and the application status is that the document review has been completed but remain under review. What does that mean?
So I would also love to know that. That is probably one of the most common things that I see. So it may mean that there are still documents that are needed and they just haven't reached out to the tenant yet to let them know that, or maybe they did reach out to the tenant and the tenant missed the email or didn't have an email in, or you never know. I get folks that go through their email and realize they missed it. That's not uncommon. But also there's 250 applications that have been submitted, and I actually don't know how many people there are reviewing them. I think they've just added about 350 volunteers within the past month. But if you divide 250,000 by 350, you get a loan back. So that could also be what's happening, is there's just, they've gotten to part of it, but not through the whole thing.
That might be true. So if a relative moves in with another relative who owns an apartment, can that person apply for Erap? And will that person who owns the apartment receive the rent? Or does it go to the rental office?
So this kind of depends on, is there a sublet that's happening? What exactly is happening? Because if somebody moves in with a relative and they just say, you can, stay on my couch or my extra bedroom, then that is not really renting. But if the person's in there as part of a household and the whole family is behind on rent and wants to apply for Erap that way, then they can try to apply for it that way. It just kind of depends on the specific facts of that case. Maybe there is a formal sublet and they've agreed to pay the family member a certain amount of money. That's great. And then it's the normal sublet rules, is the landlord owed money.
Is consideration given to elderly homeowners in need of assistance for utility payments?
Unfortunately, not at all. So this is a pure rental program. So even if somebody is a renter and only owes utilities, they won't be able to get any assistance from Erap. You have to owe some amount of rent to get help with utilities. There is, however, a program for folks that need utility assistance. It's called HEAP, H-E-A-P. And so you may want to look into HEAP.
Great. And we will share that information later on. Okay. So this person has a client who's a senior that is unable to require a birth certificate. Is he still able to apply?
So as long as he has some form of identification, which could be a driver's license, a state ID, a passport, a EBT benefits issuance card. Another option is a birth certificate. So obviously that's out, but there's a variety of things. I'm actually pulling up the checklist right now. School registration, so that won't really work. Any sort of government issued ID, I think it's not on this list, but I think a baptismal record is also allowable. Sometimes you have to dig deep and get really creative if you can't find certain things, but unfortunately there does need to be some form of personal ID.
I believe that is all the questions that we have, which is perfect. We really did this right on time. Thank you so much, Jordan. I am impressed and grateful about all the information that you know about this topic. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And everyone, we will be following up with a lot of the resources that were shared during this conversation, with the recording and with the slides. So please feel free to review and share with your colleagues. I'm also going to drop in the chat a super quick survey to let us know what else would be helpful for future events. So I'm just going to pull that up quickly. Drop it in the chat, and I will also email it out. And if you have any other questions on this topic, please feel free to email me and I will do my best to get you an answer. Okay. Thank you, everyone.